Welcome to the third in the series on research methodology. Kurt Lewin, one of the fathers of modern-day management studies, is credited with a saying, "There is nothing more practical than a good theory." And there is the original reference that is quoted in 1945. Coincidentally, this is something that we'll come back to right at the very end of this presentation. To add to this, Mark Saunders, who wrote Research Methods for Business Students, is quoted as saying there's probably no word which is more misused and misunderstood than the word theory. And indeed, your study book starts off with a unit on theory, what we mean by theory, and putting theory into practice. We do need to be aware of our language, though. And what is the difference between theory and hypothesis? This is something that you'll see in the media an awful lot, where they mix theory and hypothesis. I would imagine because theory is a lot easier to say than hypothesis. A hypothesis is something that you can test, where theory is if it works for one thing, it will work for everything under all situations, is the best way of thinking about the difference between the two. And you will remember this, which is the Management Project Diamond from the previous presentation, which talks about how we go from an organisational challenge to an implementation. We have three elements: data collection, literature, and intervention. This presentation deals with the data collection elements. In order to drive your research, you need to know what's called an intervention question. It's also often referred to as a research question. We use these two expressions interchangeably. The reason we've adopted the phrase intervention question is just to demonstrate that it's something that you do something about, rather than a research question, which is to find out about something. So if you come across the expression research question, it's exactly the same thing. The rules are it needs to be pithy, a short sentence that has plenty of depth to it. Usually, you can start off to what extent, and if you start off with that particular phrase, it is going to be an open question. We need to avoid an opposite of an open question, a closed question, to which we could just answer yes or no. Is a learning organisation a contemporary question to look at these days? Yes or no? No. End of thesis. Not exactly what we want, because a research question or an intervention question is something that you explore. So, to recap, research question is something that you explore, a hypothesis is something that you test. Three questions that I always like to ask people who I am mentoring is: what is your intervention question? Where are you going to get your data from? What literature are you going to use? Now, to start with your intervention question, it can be refined over time. It may be as you get more into your studies that you will discover that you need to refine it down a little bit, and that's fine. You can change your intervention question right until the very end, but it's something that should roll off the lips. It should be something that's memorable, and it's something that you need to explore within your management project. Because if you imagine it to be an exam question, you are setting your own exam with this particular piece of assessment. And it's the extent to which you respond to that question is a success that you will enjoy in the management project stage of your MBA. This is the main part of this presentation because it deals with the research onion. The research onion was piloted by Mark Saunders and his co-authors, and it's the best way of developing your strategy of research for your methodology. So there is a difference between method and methodology. Methodology is, if you like, the science that we study. Method is the specific set of choices that you make in order to be able to collect the data that you need to answer your research question. So your research question is then followed by your methodology. So going out from the centre then, we have data collection and data analysis, which can be either cross-sectional or longitudinal. Cross-sectional means you only do it once, which is more convenient, but most studies need to be longitudinal because you need to check the before and after. By the way, it is no defence to say that you're doing cross-sectional because you don't have the time, because we require rigour with what we are doing. You need to justify that on different grounds. Then we have whether it's mono method, mixed methods or multi-method. So mono method, you're using one thing. In mixed method, you're using quantitative and qualitative. And multi-method is some variation between the two. The main part is the element that's shown in the fourth layer, which is experiment, archival research, case study, grounded theory, action research, ethnography and survey. If we work backwards from the bottom then, survey is the most popular one. That will either be a survey through interviews or through questionnaires. Ethnography is when you're acting as an anthropologist, in effect, and studying what's going on. Action research, well, there's always an element of action research in what we do, but do be careful because it's a very complicated area and it will be more participant action research that you're actually involved in. Generally speaking, look at survey. Participant action research is actually more complicated than it sounds. In grounded theory, we start from the data and develop a theory from that data with no prejudice of what that theory is going to act or what it's going to look like. Case study is an interesting one. A number of MBA students who say they're doing a case study, it's not a case study as in the way we study case studies for the modules. What case study means, it was something that we imported from the political sciences, and in case study they always use mixed methods, so they always use quantitative and qualitative analysis, and the unit of analysis is the thing that makes the difference. And the unit of analysis in politics is usually the voting area. So do beware when you're talking case studies not the same as what we apply on the modules. Archival research, well, there's always an element of archival research, I would think. It may be, when I think of archives, I always think of dusty tomes in a library. It's not quite the same thing. Archival research can also be electronic research as well. And increasingly we use experiments, but obviously you can't experiment on people. That requires a completely different set of ethics. When I think of experiment, I often think of the milligrams experiment, where there was degrees of separation, or Zimbardo's Honey, Banks and Jaff's Stanford prison experiment, where they got students to act as guards and prisoners. And if you look that up on Wikipedia or something like that, you'll find out that it went awfully wrong. And after that, they put lots of ethical controls in. But experiment is often used for online, for example, A/B testing, or to do small experiments. An example of an experiment that I was familiar with from the management project going back a number of years is where one of the students used a number of cells for lean manufacturing, and on the basis of that they were then able to deploy it throughout the plant at Dagenham for Ford. So experiments can be small elements, but do be careful we don't experiment with people, because that would be ethically unjust, and it's more psychology than it is management. The next layer is deductive and inductive, and by inductive we mean that we tend to, well, to put a better expression, we follow our noses. Whereas in deductive we have a goal in mind and it's how we arrive there. In practice there is this middle part called hypothetico-deductive, which is we actually swing between deductive and deductive as our research develops, and it's mainly about which it's more of. So do be careful about kind of saying that it is inductive, because you can't really have one without the other. I would suggest when you are describing the research onion in your methodology chapter that you start from the inside to the out, and this is because the philosophies are generally speaking something that we do tend to overlook with at master's level, because it's mainly around PhD level when you need to make the distinction between what is interpretive and what is radical humanist. If positivism tends to be quite straightforward, and that tends to be when you're an observer outside of the system and not interacting with it. But some of the other areas, say for example subjectivism and pragmatism, are actually quite challenging and require a great deal of reading around. So my suggestion is going to be on the next slide. And on this slide, what we've done is highlight the various different areas of the Research Onion that you can use to convey to your audience in as short a time as possible what method you're going to use. So I always think of method as being a bit like my father's garage, which has lots of tools hanging up, and we're able to go in there and to use the tool that we want for a particular job. And not every tool is required for every job. We need to pick and choose whether we're using the saw, whether we're using screwdriver, so on and so forth. So in this particular example, bearing in mind this is justified from the research question or intervention question, this hypothetical example, I'm going to be using a longitudinal time horizon, I'm going to be using mixed methods, I'm going to be using survey, it's going to be inductive and also hypothetico-inductive. So within a very short space of time, I've been able to communicate to my reader exactly what method that I'm going to use from the methodology being the science of method, which shows all the choices that are available to me. So within your methodology chapter, what you do is you briefly describe the whole sets of tools to demonstrate that you have understanding of the whole area, and then you'll cut down to justify the ones that you're going to use and why you're going to use them for that particular job. And now we have one of the major hurdles to understanding at this particular level, and that's the difference between data and literature. Data and literature are, for the large part, separate. So, data can be primary or it can be secondary. Primary data is data collected by you. Secondary is data collected by someone else, but you repurpose it in often a creative way. Now, going back 10 years or so, before we had big data and so on and so forth, all of the management projects had to collect primary data. These days, that's not as key as it used to be, because we're just collecting data so much these days and analysing data that often you don't have to be able to have primary data skills, and we can gain just as much, if not more, from secondary data. So data can be characterised as being quantitative or qualitative in nature, and it can swing between the two. So for example, if you are doing text analysis and counting, you've actually gone from qualitative to quantitative. So for example, if you wanted to count the number of times it said Adam in the Bible, then you are actually going from qualitative to quantitative in nature, and it's a way of characterising the data itself rather than the research. If you refer to your study book, then what we talk about there is ideographic and nomothetic styles of research, which is a better way of describing it. So that's data. Literature is everything that's been written around a particular subject. So it can be amorphous. There's no one place where everything's stored, so it usually tends to be quite spread out, which is why we have to do a literature search. And this is split into primary, which is refereed journals of a good quality, and that can be distinguished from whether it's a 3-star, 4-star, 2-star or 1-star publication, or whether it in fact has no stars. Secondary is books and textbooks, and tertiary literature is papers and periodicals like the Financial Times, and The Economist is actually a paper. It is not a journal, even though it looks like it could be. It's actually tertiary. Now obviously, if you're quoting from primary literature, which is peer-reviewed, then that is of the highest standard. Secondary is of secondary standard, and tertiary. Now sometimes it depends on the subject area that you're going for, where you're going to get most of your references from. If you're doing something in organisational behaviour, then there's usually quite a lot of primary data, primary literature that exists in that particular area. The only bit where these two coincide is where there is data that's actually embedded as a table in the literature. That could count as secondary data in that particular instance, but that tends to be that rare that you'd usually try and summarise it in any case. But you need to be very, very clear in your mind of the difference between data and literature. You have to have both within your MBA project. As I already talked about, you need to be able to submit your ethics form with your academic mentor's consent to the ethics committee in order to get permission to collect the data. In that form, you will declare what data you're going to collect and exactly how you're going to collect it, which is why you need to do your methodology first. The four major areas are privacy, that the people who are participating in the research are doing so voluntarily, that there is consent, and that consent needs to be confirmed, and also that the data that's collected is going to be confidential, and also participants are going to be guaranteed anonymity. Other ethical concerns includes what's known as reflexivity, which is the reaction of participants to the way in which you seek to collect data. So, for example, if you were interviewing someone and you were declaring surprise as to what the answers would be, that would not be a good thing. Another thing that needs to be avoided is where you are researching with people who actually are responsible to you. That is not ethical because they may feel coerced into participating in the study. Next is the effects of the participants on the way in which you use, analyse and report your data, again guaranteeing anonymity, and also the extent to which your behaviour can be seen as objective. At the start of this presentation, I talked to you about there is nothing as practical as a good theory, and this really underlines what we mean by good scholarship. This is a paper where the aphorism is looked at in detail, and it came to the conclusion that whilst Kurt Lewin may have popularised the saying, he certainly didn't say it in the original sense. There was a feeling given throughout the paper that it was more of a common German expression which he brought over when he went to work in the United States. And the quote at the bottom there is really about, once errors of attribution appear in print, they often become diffused and amplified, taking on a life of their own as they are transmitted from generation to generation unchecked. And that was actually the series of a very innovative paper by an academic called Anne Will Harsing, where she was talking about referencing errors perpetuating myths that actually exist. So good scholarship is about providing provenance. So what you need to do as a rule is you need to have actually seen the evidence itself in the paper, which is also why you need to avoid using nested references. So a nested reference is saying, as quoted in such and such a paper, when you're quoting both of those particular papers, because it's not an example of good provenance and is best avoided. You always go back to the original, because when you do go back to the original, you often find that the person who is making the claim can often have been misrepresented by later authors. So that's just an example of why we need good scholarship, because good scholarship is around protecting ideas and ensuring that the good ideas are the ones that are actually reflected in our research. These are the sources that I recommend you look at, especially the Saunders book, Research Methods for Business Students, and these recommendations are in descending order of priority. And I do apologise for my sense of humour at the top right of this slide. I couldn't resist. Thank you once again for listening to Research Methodology.